Hi everyone again, I'm Amy. I'm currently an engineer at Stripe, but I'm only 3 weeks old. I'm not going to be talking about Stripe today, so whatever you hear from this, it's not about Stripe. And I figured I should throw a cute animal on here to distract you all from that. You can find my contact info right there. And today I'm going to be talking about how you can evaluate a vendor and the kinds of mistakes you might be making along the way. So this is more going to be a story. I'm just going to take you through the arc of my first time evaluating a vendor. And it starts with what we were doing. We were using logging in order to detect and investigate incidents. And so before, we were using hosted Elasticsearch at my old company. We ran into a ton of problems using Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. And most of them were due to the fact that we didn't know a lot about what we were doing. Every time we ran into problems, we just kind of threw more instances at and hoped that that would work out. So we just kept throwing more and more money at the problem, even if it was like a sharding problem or something like that. And so we also realized that we were taking up like one full-time engineer's time just to fix all of these ELK problems. And so we kept thinking, if we're throwing away money at this problem, we keep just adding more and more instances and wasting all this time on it, then what if we just started shoveling money at someone else and made them fix our problems for us? And so that's why I became the lead for investigating whether or not a logging vendor could solve all of our problems for us. And then I realized that afterwards, when I was reflecting on everything that happened, I realized that I made mistakes during every single step of this process. So I want to walk you through all of the things I did. And you should also remember that at the end of this, we did eventually sign a contract with the vendor. And then afterwards, that's when I realized that I made a ton of mistakes. But the vendor is pretty great. I'm trying to be pretty general here so that we can all apply these lessons to whatever trials we might be doing in the future. So let's go into the steps. First, you have to integrate your data with the product. You have to evaluate the requirements that your company, your coworkers have. You have to learn what else. You have to go through all these sales pitches. You have to learn what the product has to offer for you. And then you have to gather the feedback and make a decision. So we'll be walking through each of these. This is the secret agenda slide. I realized I didn't write agenda on there. So let's start with integrating. The first question you need to ask is, can all of your data get into the system at scale? So what happened with me is I took one example of logs that I thought were pretty important, started sending them into the system, and I thought, okay, great, it works. That means check, I can send the data in. And then I realized that there was actually a ton of different types of logs that we needed to send into the system, including, for example, logs that required regular expressions, which I feel really ashamed right now, so please hold your judgment. We had plain text logs that were for HTTP responses, like 500s and 200s. We needed to use regular expressions to parse out the status code and then only send the 500s off to the vendor so that we don't blow up our quota with 200s, which are not very interesting. And so we realized after a while that we were using Logstash for this, and the amount of processing time it takes to use regular expressions and then filter it made Logstash fall behind on sending the data in a quick way. And I'm guessing that there was a reasonable solution to this, but I didn't realize that. And so we only figured out that all these problems were going to happen after we signed the contract, which was really embarrassing for us because we were like, wow, we can't get varnish logs into the vendor. That means that all of those logs have to stay on Elasticsearch, and the rest of the other logs will just tell everyone to go there. And so you don't want people to fork off and use two different logging systems. So when it comes to getting your data in, make sure you really, really know what you're doing. And I'm kind of upset because I Googled Logstash logo so I could make a point here, and then I saw this, and I was like, oh, that's so creepy. So that's why I put it there. It turns out that's not the Logstash logo, but it really freaks me out, so I hope you all enjoyed that picture. So the next thing you have to care about is spikes and quotas. There's a lot of different ways you can handle dealing with spikes, but it can be really, really helpful if the vendor works together with you to mitigate spikes. So one example would be if you have a bunch of rogue collectors installed on each host, and maybe you personally do not have access to those collectors, maybe a different team started those collectors and you can't shut them off, and suddenly someone accidentally starts sending debug level logs and up to the vendor, just hypothetically, and you can't stop them. It would be really great if the vendor tool had a way to help you out with that situation. And so, hypothetically, What happened with us, okay, fuck it, it's not hypothetical. We kept we kept emailing them like, please, we're sending like a terabyte of data and we don't have that kind of quota, help us. And then it was kind of this back and forth where they said, we don't have the tools to shut it off, you should shut it off. And I kept saying, I'm trying to get them to shut it off, but they're not awake. And so these are all good things to know, during the trial when they hopefully are not charging you money for sending them terabytes of data. That would be good. And so, there's the side where you should figure out if they have the tools for helping you out here, or whether you have the tools to deal with spikes and rogue collectors. But you should also think about what the financial side impact of this is. Like, what are they going to do if you go over your quota, or what are they going to do if you go over your daily limit? Because I think my nightmare, and this is not what happened, but my nightmare is that actually the vendor is Lucille Bluth, and she's just saying, what do you think? It's like 1 terabyte. What could it cost? Like $1 million? So it's good to get on the same page and make sure you all know what the financial and like technical impacts are. Because for a different example would be like if you are sending 2 different types of logs. Let's say one of them is like mission critical, very important to like to the SREs at your team, and some are just silly like business hours type logs that are shuttable. You do want to make it known that these 2 types of logs are of different levels of importance and that one should not throttle the other. And so these are all things that you should work out during the trial, not after the trial. And so in summary, you want to test every way that you're going to send data. Don't just like hand wave it. Really, really like dig in there and make sure that you can actually integrate with the system correctly. You want to make sure that the vendor is willing to work with you and that they have reasonable tools, or you have reasonable tools to deal with spikes and quotas, because that will be a large part of your ongoing relationship with them. And the next piece is that we're going to talk about how to evaluate requirements. So I'm going to start with what my original requirements were. I did write up like a huge 1-page doc, but the gist of it was that I wanted to work with the deploy team and the SRE team. So the deploy team wanted to know if there's something wrong with Canary, which is the test cluster where you deploy to before you deploy to prod. So they wanted to make sure that they could detect errors that were happening in Canary before they released to the wild. And then the SRE team, of course, they want to make sure that the site is healthy, and they want to be able to track down incidents if it's not healthy. So I thought, oh, that's pretty reasonable. And so I wrote this out, and I said, these are the 2 things I'm going to be focusing on for the duration of this trial. And the good thing about that is that I did talk to real customers and figure out what their real problems were, and in a pretty narrow way. That's only 2 teams. I don't have to worry about like whether the growth team or the web team is happy with the logging. So there are pros to being this focused, but the problem was that I was actually not specific enough. When I thought about these questions, they went and we talked together in person about how to solve, what kinds of problems they wanted to solve. I didn't go into detail about what that really meant. So I thought it meant like write some dashboards, write some queries, send them the queries, and then they can just run it on the product. And what they were thinking was more along the lines of like using APIs to write automated scripts that would run every once in a while. Some other team wanted like TV optimized displays, so like they wanted it to be able to refresh like periodically every few seconds. Some people wanted alerts, and those were all like details I didn't really ask about. So those are all really important things. So when I said like, oh, well, one team wants to know if there's problems in Canary and the other one wants to know if there's problems with the site, that seems legit. That is not enough detail. And the second problem is that it's not just about the engineers. Your company has so many people who are not engineers, and they all are very invested in the outcome of this product. And so I have a list here, and it's funny, I made this list and I wasn't complete. So there's compliance and legal, so make sure you know what the laws are about like where you're storing your data and what's going on with like privacy or PII. And you need to know what the security and IT teams think about your product, and and those 2 I'd say are the most important, so you should make sure you talk to them for sure. And then you should also involve engineering managers and executives, because they might not necessarily be power users or daily users, but they do have very important and different needs for the product if they are going to be using it. And so this is going to be the most important part. And I know like some people like to like tweet pictures of slides, so that's why I was like, I'm going to be real obvious. This is going to be the most important one. If you remember anything else, this is it. We're going to go through all of the things I didn't do when I was evaluating the security of the site, and then everyone will be good. So the first question that you need to be asking yourself is, how are users authenticating and signing on to the site? Does the company offer SSO? Do they offer two-factor authentication? Is there a way for you to lock the site down to be behind your VPN? And the reason why this is so important is because if someone leaves your company and they still have access to the site, that's all of your private data right there. And two-factor we've heard a lot about, but it'll hopefully help prevent more leaks. And so I wrote this down. Make sure that people cannot access the site after they've left, and also make sure nobody's sharing accounts. Hypothetically. But there's a lot of reasons why people might want to share accounts and passwords, and that's a terrible thing because you have no way of knowing which individual employee at your company is asking for which data. So if you have audit logs, it doesn't matter if you are sharing accounts, the audit logs are useless. So these are all important things I didn't think about. And then the other important things are you need to make sure you know who's managing permissions. So if you're using this site for really private data, and I realize yeah, you should scrub the private data before you send it to the third party, but not everyone's perfect. Sometimes you do send private data. You do want to make sure it's not available to every single employee at your company or to people outside of your company. So if that's email addresses or credit cards or URLs, any kind of URLs or Facebook IDs, these are all really important things. So if they say yes, we do have permissions so that you can assign people to a certain user group, you have to try that out and make sure that it's reasonable and works in a way that makes sense at your company, especially if you have different groups of people who all have overlapping permissions. And then you should also make sure that data is sent to the system in a secure way. The really funny thing is that for context, I left college 2 years ago, and I took one security class, and I basically slept through the entire class. So I know nothing about security, and yet people still, someone thought it was okay for me to evaluate the security of the system, which is not smart. And so I guess I thought there's a secret URL, you can post to the secret URL, as long as you don't leak that URL, then you're fine. And then some other people were saying oh, well, blah, 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 you gotta have secret tokens inside the headers because of some sort of weird web thing. And I was I don't know what you're saying. But the point is that I was not the right person to make these calls. So again, this is the most important slide of the whole talk. And if you're gonna go tell your friends about this talk, you can say, just go to that slide and make sure you're not fucking up the security of your company by not knowing what you're doing with when you're evaluating a vendor. So it's dangerous to go alone. Make sure you work really, really closely with one or two teams and make sure you really know what they want. Not just a vague, I want to make sure the site is healthy, but how do they intend to get those questions answered? And then, of course, the second one is if you're not an expert, find someone who is an expert. Don't trust the new grad to evaluate your security if they aren't a security expert. And of course, make a list of requirements, communicate it very clearly, make sure everyone is really on board with what you're doing. And then third, this one's going to be really short, but let's talk about sales. I got really caught up in sales pitches for really shiny features. For example, sometimes people say things about anomaly detection, or they'll say we offer machine learning. We don't know what we're doing with machine learning, but we have it, so you're going to like it. And that's terrible because that doesn't really say how is machine learning going to solve your problem? So if they start telling you about this stuff and you don't know how this fancy feature is actually going to apply to the real situations at your company, it's a fucking trap. Don't listen to them. If it doesn't actually work with your data set, it's useless. It doesn't even matter if they say, oh, it'll be better in a few months, we're still working on it, it's growing, it'll be more mature soon. If it's going to be more mature in 6 months, then you can talk to them in 6 months. So I thought this was important enough to just put in really big letters, if it doesn't provide you value right now, it does not provide value. And so we got all caught up in really shiny features that I thought were 90% there to solving a very clear problem that my company had, but it just wasn't right yet. And I wish I had ignored those problems, that feature. I did spend a few hours trying to make it work, and I should have stopped there rather than trying to push that this feature was actually going to be a game changer. So the sales pitches, you gotta have a stone heart when it comes to sales pitches. The most important thing is you should not take okay for an answer, and this is hard for me because I guess my personality is kind of like if someone says yes, I just take it and then keep going on. But if I had used those audit logs that I had mentioned, I would have realized that a bunch of the engineers who told me like, yes, product looks good, let's go with it, never even logged onto the site. Like I literally wrote the queries later and I was like, wait, so-and-so only logged in like once and they said it was okay? That's bullshit, they didn't even try it. So a lot of the people who told me like, okay, looks good, after we signed, they came back to me and were like, hey, why doesn't the product do this thing I want? And my instinct was to say, I don't know, I guess you should have told me during the trial if you wanted that. But that's not like a mature or like productive answer. After you've signed the trial, you're like stuck with this vendor, so you have to make it work for your customers. So it's really, really easy for people to not be like invested in or like prioritize your project. They're really busy, they all have their own things to do. But if they're not giving you like a well-informed or like genuine, like yes, ship it, like I want this, I want to buy this thing, don't trust them, because they will come back and yell at you. And the second thing is, this is something I did not do. I should have simulated a situation where this was the only tool and taken away Elasticsearch. What I found was that every time there was like a site-wide incident, everyone would just go back to Elasticsearch and debug through there because they were comfortable with it. But that's obviously that's a huge problem because that means that no one's ever tested the new product in a like high-pressure situation. And so I think if I'd really been introspective at the time, I would have realized the fact that everyone was afraid to turn off Elasticsearch probably meant that we weren't ready for this new tool. And maybe a part of that is like just, people don't like new things and everyone wants to stay with their old workflows. But part of it could have been also that the tool wasn't the right tool to evaluate like when we were having a site-wide incident. So it did help most of the time. I'm not trying to make this anonymous product sound bad. We actually have a pretty good time with it, I hope. I left the company, so I hope they're still doing good. And the third thing is you should be okay with deliberating. This trial happened over the holiday season around like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. And the funny thing about that, in retrospect, is that, first of all, most companies will do feature freezes during the holidays because you don't want to not be able to sell things during the holidays. And everyone's away, so even if there was a problem, people are like with their families. So there wasn't very much time, like real time in the office that people could be evaluating the product, and it wasn't the right situation in which to be evaluating. And I think maybe it's my personality, but I guess I was kind of like, oh, I need to follow the timeline that the salesperson is giving me because I want to meet deadlines. And what I really should have realized is like I'm the person with the money. I can just say like, nah, we'll wait a few months. We'll keep thinking about it, and they can't. It's not like they can really do anything about that. It's not like they can just say, okay, I guess we're not selling it to you because they still want your money. And so I should have been more, I guess, willing to say no or willing to wait until maybe a few months after New Year's. But at the time, the combination of saying like, well, everyone says it's okay, it totally meets all of our features, led us to sign the contract, and then after a while, like start uncovering things that we should have thought about during the evaluation. So to recap, constant vigilance from Harry Potter. It's like relevant to all of our lives. So when it comes to integrating your data, make sure you're testing for everything you care about. When you're evaluating, don't do it alone. Even if other people are too busy to give you their time, make them give you their time. Don't get pulled in by shiny features when you're learning more about the product. And make sure that you're getting genuine, well-informed, honest feedback. It's really important because you are signing away like hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for like a multi-year contract usually. So it's pretty important that you get it right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so my old company was, we were sending like millions of metrics per second to OpenTSDB. So we did rely heavily on monitoring or metrics for alerting. When it comes to debugging, I guess I've heard a lot about like different kinds of anti-patterns where like people think you shouldn't be looking at like individual logs in order to debug. I think we were still in the stage where like looking at individual stack traces and was the best way to go. And then I guess the other piece was, it was often like one specific host that was having problems. And so with the logs, you could like break it down and say like, oh, this host is one that's having problems, let's just shut it down. I realized that you could do that with metrics as well, which says a lot about things that we could have improved. I think the security stuff was the one that shocked me the most, because I guess the whole time when I did it, at the beginning, the security team actually handed me this like gigantic document that was like a security questionnaire. I didn't even read it. I just like forwarded it to the vendor and said, please fill this out, and then I passed it back. I skimmed it and I saw they said yes to every single question. I figured that because the vendor said yes to every question, then we were fine for security. So I didn't think about it very much. And then slowly, as I learned more and more about all the different like security issues, like with single sign-on and password sharing and even the headers or permissions, all those things, I was like, oh my God, why didn't I think about that sooner? Like, all these things make sense. Like, these are all very reasonable things that an engineer should know regarding security, and I just didn't even think about them. And so I felt a little bit embarrassed about that. Ideal customer. Okay, first of all, you gotta sign into the fucking product. If you don't sign in, I can't, like, I was pretty upset. Like, I was getting feedback from people who had literally never logged onto the system, and I don't think they knew that I knew that, but I guess I was too, let's see. I think the best kind of customer would be someone who, like, during their day-to-day, they take notes on what they're using the old system for. So, like, they know that that during incidents, they like to look at stack tracers, or they like to break it down by file or something like that. They know what kinds of questions they generally want to answer. That's pretty helpful. Honestly, I think if you spend time with the product during the trial, you're like already miles ahead of every other one of my coworkers. So I'd say like a basic query language where you can like count and aggregate logs. That's pretty much the bare minimum. I think what would set apart a logging service, now that I've like tried a couple, is first of all speed. Like, if it takes forever to load the logs, people just get really angry. And then the second is probably like, how easy is it for a person who isn't already like hasn't been using it for like several years to figure out what they want. It's really easy to like get stuck in the query language where it doesn't even tell you that you made a typo somewhere, or that you're writing something that's like syntactically wrong. Like, even Elasticsearch doesn't really tell Kibana doesn't really tell you if you did something wrong. It just says no results. Which is, I think, a terrible experience. So I think a logging platform that tells you like or tries to kind of guide you towards what you're trying to do is the most helpful. I think the problem with what I'm saying is that I'm speaking from the side of like an engineer who's not a site reliability engineer, because we were trying to meet many customers' needs. So if you're like a product engineer, you might just be using it in your day-to-day to debug. And so those are the kinds of needs I'm talking about, whereas like the site reliability team needs to be moving extremely quickly and doing things like maybe in the middle of the night, or maybe just they need to get the site back up. And so those are two different, like totally different personalities or personas. Thanks.